Sounds
That
good.
okay. All right. Sounds good. Why don't you introduce yourself to us and our audience?
My name is Tamiko Theil. I'm an American media artist of mixed Japanese and German extraction. I grew up partially in Seattle and partially in Kamakura, Japan. And then when I was an adult, I moved at the age of 27 to Germany and have been based there ever since. And I started out as a package design engineer, product design engineer with a degree from Stanford Product Design in 1979. Worked for a couple of years at Hewlett Packard doing computer terminal packaging design back in the days when there were computer terminals attached to mainframes, and those were the only types of computers available. Brought two products to market, and then went on to MIT, where I got a degree, a master's in mechanical engineering. But after the first year where I satisfied my mechanical engineering requirements, I discovered what became the Media Lab after I graduated, and decided really on the spot that I wanted to become a media artist. And then I got sidetracked when my friend Danny Hillis, who was getting his PhD under Marvin Minsky at the AI lab, then 3 days after graduation asked me to lead the product design effort for his thesis project, the Connection Machine, which became the first commercial AI supercomputer built at the company Thinking Machines Corporation. So I ran that effort for the 2 years that it took to get the design set. And then I said, I'm out of here. I moved to Europe and ended up landing in Munich, where I got another degree, an art degree at the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich, and finished up with a video piece, video installation that I just showed in my retrospective at the Kunstverein Wolfsburg in Germany. But that was basically my path to becoming a media artist. And then I was working in video for the 90s, while at the same time in 1994, I was hired by Worlds Incorporated in San Francisco to work with Steven Spielberg, the filmmaker, on what became the first metaverse for children, Starbright World, an online interactive avatar-driven 3D virtual world connecting 5 hospitals nationwide, where seriously ill children could meet with each other from the playrooms in hospitals. And of course, they would keep an eye out to see if they could see E.T., because they knew that Steven Spielberg was always behind E.T. Well, I had been working in video art and had moved to San Francisco just because it seemed like a nice place to live. And I met up with Brewster Kahle and his wife, Mary Austin, who have a digital salon. And everyone at the meal was talking about the web. I was going like, what's the web? My husband, Peter Graff, says, oh, don't you know the web is going to transform the whole world? And I went, sure, I've heard that before. But it was true. And that was September of 1994. And 2 weeks later, I talked with David Marvitt, who, together with his brother, Macklin Marvitt, had started the company Worlds Incorporated out of the Knowledge Adventure company that was doing, I think, CD-ROMs games. And the idea of Worlds Incorporated was to create what is now being called the metaverse, what we called cyberspace at that point. Online, virtual, multi-user worlds where you're represented by an avatar and you could talk through text chat, because that was about what you could get through the ISDN lines that people would have at home. So the project that they hired me to do was called Starbright World. This was the brainchild of Steven Spielberg, who was at that time the chairman of the Starbright Foundation, a foundation founded, I think, out of Hollywood, essentially, to bring together Hollywood people and high-tech people, games industry people, and the medical profession to create digital content for children who are seriously and chronically ill, and help them to either deal with their diseases, their conditions, or to, for instance, distract them when they were getting painful treatments. And it was Steven Spielberg's idea to say, because he had heard of this new technology, which, by the way, had only existed for a couple of years, when in 1992, Silicon Graphics had gotten people together to create the open source OpenGL standard for interactive real-time 3D computer graphics. And Spielberg had heard that it's now possible to do these online virtual worlds and said, hey, let's build a Starbright world for these kids who can't leave the hospital so that they can meet other kids who have their same conditions and trade information, talk with them. And, you know, these kids who can't get out of the hospital, we will provide them with virtual worlds where they can run around and play with each other, communicate with each other. So at that point in 1994, there weren't a lot of people who had a lot of expertise in combining art and technology. Of course, there had been a number of people, but not a whole lot. And so for me, really the kind of winning card was that I had just recently spearheaded the product design development of the connection machines. This was a job where combining the visual, the graphic, the aesthetic, and the highly technical aspect of the world's first commercial AI supercomputer really was a job that showed that I could do this sort of mixture of art and technology. So I was hired as a producer, having not really done anything except dabbling with computer graphics a little bit in the architecture machine group during my graduate studies at MIT as a mechanical engineer. So we worked with Steven Spielberg. We had a team of two artists, and Parker, damn, what was his last name? Parker Moore and Mike. We had a team of two graphic artists, Parker Moore and Mike Spivak, and we had a team of two programmers, Keith Rosema and Michael, I'm forgetting his last name. Basically, they had to write everything from scratch, develop everything from scratch, and create this world, Starbright World, which had several different spaces, and kids could go between those spaces and basically see each other, run around together, chat with each other, and explore things. And it was actually Steven Spielberg's idea that some of the things you would need to have another person to, for instance, open a door. It would only open if there were two of you there. So you would have to collaborate. And poor Stephen is used to, of course, just spouting out ideas a mile a minute, as he can and does, and having people run off and implement them in his films. And it must have been a bit frustrating for him to work with a new technology where, the programmers were going like, hey, we're programming as fast as we can, and it's going to take some time, and it's going to be unstable because this is a new technology. So we had several different spaces, all interconnected, a desert oasis and a sky world and an underground cave system, and then a build your own zone where kids could also create their own buildings and create their own activities. They built a racetrack and held races there. This ran from 1995 to 1997 between 5 hospitals that were linked nationwide. And the kids loved it. I mean, it pulled them out of their beds to see this new technology that no one else had at that time. Really, almost no one had it, and certainly no kids. And of course, they were also excited to look for E.T., who was Steven Spielberg's avatar. You know, we at some point we said we got to build an avatar for Stevens, and what should it be? And we said, well, you know, we should ask him. We all kind of had an idea, but when we put the question to him, he immediately said, "Oh, E.T., of course," which probably tells you a lot about Steven Spielberg. But it debuted with this live, you know, we had 5 hospitals live nationwide, camera teams live nationwide at 5 different locations. And after that, I said I'd never want to do an internet event again. The stress was incredible, but it went off wonderfully. One of the machines went down. I think Steven Spielberg's machine went down, but we had a tech person right next to him, and he booted it before the camera went back to Steven. So that was really a wonderful chance to involve kids in that sort of technology. I left for various reasons in January of 1996. And one thing that I implemented before I left was to say, let's take kids' drawings and make the kids' drawings avatars in the world and see what that leads to. Because Steven Spielberg had donated his top animators who were supposed to work on a new film, but because of contractual delays, they were sitting around for a couple months with nothing to do. So Steven said, well, you know, you can use my animators. They'll make, they'll draw the avatars for you. These were not 3D avatars; they were actually 2D avatars, where depending on the angle that you looked at the avatar, you present different sides of that avatar. But they were animated in the old-fashioned technique of making different, you know, a series of drawings that showed the avatar walking from front and side and back, etc. So the kids' drawings that we put into the space were not animated. It was just a single sprite, a single non-animated image. But we started getting stories back about how kids would look at those avatars, because you could choose which avatar you wanted to use, and say, hey, this is a kid's drawing. That means that I could create my own world. I could create this space too. It's not just like being handed down from, you know, the world's top animation avatars and Steven Spielberg. And the build your own zone that we had, where everything was like a series of blocks and you could build together buildings out of blocks. You could, like I said, they put together a racetrack and they had races, also fostered this idea of this is something you can build yourself. It's not a black box where you have no idea how it works. So those were really key ideas that I loved about Starbright World. And then, of course, got realized a decade later in Second Life, when the technology was better. I mean, people had ADSL connections at home. The computers were more powerful, and so more people could run this sort of virtual world on their computers. Whereas 94 to 97, you basically had to have like a $5,000 PC donated to us by Intel, and the T1 and T2 lines that were used to connect the hospitals together nationwide. And if you didn't have that, you really couldn't run the space on it. So that was the for me the beginning of working with virtual reality, first as producer and essentially creative director for this project, and then I took a version of that technology, VRML, and started making my own artworks, starting with Beyond Manzanar. But that's the second story, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Well, that's a great journey. That it was like a beginning of an era. Actually, that what happened in the early 90s. And you talked about the transition from the packaging design into digital art. Was that an intentional transition for you, or what inspired you to expand your practice from engineering and design into digital art using AR, VR mediums?
The reason that I decided to become a media artist was in some ways because I worked on the connection machine AI supercomputer. So I had always wondered, do I want to go into art? Do I want to go into the sciences? And as a freshman at Stanford, I was in a high energy physics seminar called The Ultimate Nature of Matter. They had just discovered quarks and thought they had found the smallest building blocks of the universe. Turns out, of course, that wasn't true, but that's what we thought at the time. So I was working as a work student. My advisor had given me a job at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. I was in this heady atmosphere of, we think we've found the secrets of the universe. And I was also taking art classes in the same year as a freshman. But art at that point, and we're talking 1974, was very much art for art's sake. So for instance, in the painting class, the entire discourse, let's say, was that the teacher set up a still life and said, paint this. And then she set up a different still life and said, paint this. And that was about it. I mean, maybe she talked a little bit more about art and what art is and why we would want to do art, but I don't remember anything. And compared to physics, where I was understanding the way the world worked, not from a sort of societal viewpoint, but from a physical viewpoint, art seemed really boring and disconnected from life. And then when I graduated from Stanford, I ended up going into product design because it allowed me to fuse together the art and design side and engineering sides of my nature. At that point, the Stanford product design program in the mid-late 70s was one of the very few programs in the world that allowed you to take classes in art, in design, and in this case, mechanical engineering. So that for me was really bringing together all my interests. And the first time I felt like I really found some place where I felt at home and where the different facets of my interests, my personality, and my abilities really found a field that I could work in. So I worked for Hewlett Packard for a couple of years as a product design engineer, brought a couple of products onto market during that time. But, working in the packaging design field was not quite as exciting as being a design student, where you're free to ideate, come up with your own ideas, think about how would you want to address the problems of the world in a design project. So I felt like I was lacking something. Wasn't sure what. So I went to MIT for grad school in mechanical engineering. And then after getting my first year's requirements out of the way, was thumbing through the paper card catalog and stumbled upon the visual language workshop courses and the architecture machine group courses in the architecture department of MIT. Now, these became the Media Lab, but only several years after I already graduated. So at that point, I didn't know about this concept of the Media Lab coming up. They were probably already planning it, but I started taking courses. I took a course in computer graphics, but what you could do at that point really was programming at a very basic level. And so it would take months in order to be able to visualize, a spinning cube. Mm-hmm. And this didn't really tap into my artistic interests either. But the other courses, words, images, graphic tools from Peter Dröge, opened up my my eyes to how you can use visual design, visual art to address all of society, all of culture. And and so really at that moment, thumbing through that card catalog, I said, this is what I want to do. I want to become a media artist. So I had to finish up my degree, but I could take classes in whatever graduate level courses there were. And so half of my time at MIT was taking courses in the architecture machine group and visual language workshop. And then I was going to look for art schools and I was thinking, should I move to New York? And then I got derailed when Danny Hillis, doing his PhD under Marvin Minsky at the MIT AI lab, who was a good, Danny was a good friend of mine. I hung out with him a lot and at Marvin Minsky's house a lot. And he asked me to join his new startup, Thinking Machines, to lead the packaging design mechanical engineering effort to build his thesis, The Connection Machine, which became the first commercial AI supercomputer. So at Thinking Machines, you know, and the way that Danny won me over was saying, and if you do, you get to work with Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize physicist. And I went, where do I sign? Where do I sign? Because so I said, where do I sign? Because of course, as a former physics graduate, I was totally in love with the Richard Feynman's lectures on physics, and he was a totally cool character. And it turned out he was like that in real life. So yeah, so that's another hour lecture. Richard Feynman was designing the router, and that became an integral part of the design of the package because it was a 12-dimensional Boolean n cube. But like I said, that's an hour lecture. So so basically, I had 2 years at Thinking Machines where the only criterion was this has got to work, and it's got to be knock dead gorgeous, because we're a young company. You know, I was 26, Danny was 26. A lot of the engineers were younger, and we had to convince people that when they walked into the room, that this was a machine like they've never seen before in their life. And if it looked like a refrigerator, then we would have lost. So the design did have that visual aspect. It was a cube of cubes, a black cube of cubes as large as I am, with transparent doors where you could see the lights connected to each of the chips blinking and talking about what the machine was thinking about. And so I had 2 years just thinking about why are we making this machine? What does this machine mean to us? What are the ways that humans have dealt with the concept of artificial intelligence, of creating intelligence over thousands of years of human history in many different cultures around the world? How is it expressed in film, in science fiction, in images? And you can imagine, after 2 years of this freedom, where they told me, like, don't worry about what it costs. The machine's going to cost $3 to $5 million anyway. The packaging will be such a small portion of it, it doesn't matter. You can imagine, after 2 years of this freedom, what is it like to say, okay, now you have to like design a plastic part that snaps into place and requires only one screw. And I said, no, I'm out of here. I'm going to pursue my dream of becoming an artist, because as an artist, you can go wherever you want. You can address whatever interests you. You can use your art projects to be explorations of your relationship to this question, to the world, to the universe, to society, to art history, whatever you want.
Exactly.
And that's the freedom of art.
Or freedom of expression of art, or however you want to, frame it. Now we're going to go ahead and get into the talk of the beyond Manzanar. Actually, that's the piece that really I was interested in knowing and asking more about it. If you can describe for our readers and discuss your inspiration and collaboration with Zara Hushman.
So while I was working at Worlds Incorporated, I had met through friends Zara Hushman, who has had, even at that point in 1994, an incredibly rich background, not only as a poet and a theater director, but also had, created multimedia presentations on different ethnic groups in Iran. She's half Iranian, half European extraction, and was living in San Francisco at that time. And I told her I just got this job at this incredible company, Worlds Incorporated. And by the way, they're looking for producers who have backgrounds working with art and technology. Why don't you talk to them? So she became a producer also at Worlds Incorporated. And as two of the people with very strong art backgrounds at that company, we started talking a lot about, well, how could you use this sort of technology, this interactive real-time computer graphic virtual reality technology to create art? And we became very close friends. And in 1995, if you recall, there was the second attack on the World Trade Center.
Right.
I'm sorry, the first attack on the World Trade Center. In 1995, if you recall, there was the Oklahoma City bombing. And in the first couple of days after the bombing, people were going, oh, maybe it's Islamic terrorists, because 2 years before, in 1993, had been an attack on the World Trade Center, and it was by Islamic terrorists. And it turns out that after a couple of days, they found out, no, it's homegrown white American, fascists who, were quite happy to kill a couple hundred people, including a whole kindergarten class, by bombing this building in Oklahoma City. And talking with Zara after that, it turns out that she had gone to a retreat in the high Sierras. And right before she entered this retreat, where she was going to be cut off from any news for a week, she had heard about the bombing. And her first thoughts were also, oh my God, what if this really is, what if it's people connected to Iran? Will all people of Iranian nationality, all people with Iranian heritage be thrown into internment camps like happened to Japanese Americans in World War II? And it turns out that the retreat she was at was very close to the Manzanar site, where the first of these incarceration camps was built in World War II. And you might know there were over 10 of these incarceration centers. They housed men, women, children, kids with only partial Japanese ancestries were pulled out of orphanages because a drop of Japanese blood made you a threat to the security of the United States. People who are old people were literally brought out of hospitals on stretchers and sent in sealed trains into the desert, destination unknown, because a dying elderly Japanese American is a threat to the security of the country. Well, it turned out, of course, in the 80s, when the Freedom of Information Act was able to force open all of the documents, that we found out that the Justice Department had lied to the Supreme Court, saying that we have information that is so top secret that not even the Supreme Court justices can see it. But this top secret invisible evidence shows that all Japanese, down to a drop of Japanese blood, are a threat to the security. Well, of course, Freedom of Information Act showed no, that was a bald-faced lie from the Justice Department during World War II, and that actually 6 different studies from different parts of the government and the US military all said no. If there were any Japanese or Japanese Americans who were a threat, we got them the first night after Pearl Harbor, put them in FBI concentration camps, and the remaining 120,000 men, women, children, elderly are not a threat to America. This information was suppressed, and then the lie that said exactly the opposite was used to justify divesting these people of their lives, their livelihood, their freedom, and putting them in prison camps for the duration of Second World War. So that was the historical background. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, when Zara came back from visiting Manzanar, and I hadn't been to Manzanar yet at that point, she said, you know, the scary thing is I visited that site thinking that if this bombing in Oklahoma City had some connection to Iran, I might be imprisoned here for the rest of my life. But you know what? It is so beautiful there. Everything I've read from the Japanese Americans said it's a desert hell. It's dry, it's barren. But you know what? It looks like the landscapes of Iran. It's a high desert plateau at the foot of a towering snow-covered mountain, Mount Williamson. And the runoff, the snow melt, creates a small oasis called Manzanar at the foot of these beautiful mountains in the middle of the desert. And in fact, as I walk, I'm paraphrasing her own words will be slightly different. But she told me that as she walked around the site, you know, the only things left at that point were this grid of partially tarred roads. And she said even this geometric grid in the desert reminded her of the grids of Iranian paradise gardens that had been abandoned and taken back by the desert. And then she showed me sketches and drawings and photographs of Iranian paradise gardens and how the geometry of the gardens expresses the perfection of paradise. And when she started talking about gardens in the middle of the desert, it triggered a memory of what I had heard at family gatherings in Seattle as a child among my Japanese American relatives. I remember the adults saying something like, the Japanese are so crazy, you know, after they got put into the camps in the middle of the desert, they started planting flowers. And so I went online, and remember, this is 1995. So there wasn't a lot online, but there was a little bit of stuff online. And the first thing that came up when I Googled Manzanar Garden Desert was a photograph from Ansel Adams of one of the gardens in Manzanar. And I looked at that photograph and I said, this is a paradise garden, a Japanese paradise garden, because it has a rock that looks like a crane and a rock that looks like a turtle. And those are symbols of paradise used in Japanese paradise gardens. And Zara and I looked at each other and said, oh my God, this is an art project.
Wow.
Zara told me later that she thought, yes, it's an art project. I'm going to write a poem about it. And I went, Zara, this is an art project. And you know what? It has to be done in virtual reality.
Because it was the moment of inspiration for you to both of you. Yeah.
Right. To say not only we would like to make a work of art in virtual reality, but this is a subject that makes it perfect for the medium, especially when I read the book Farewell to Manzanar by Jean Wakatsuki Houston. She talked about how as a child, she was maybe 8 or 9 or so at the time when she was first imprisoned in Manzanar. She wrote about how she would go to one of the gardens and would sit carefully choosing her viewpoint so she could not see any barracks or barbed wire or guard towers. She would only see this beautiful garden, and as long as she did not move, she could pretend she was in paradise of her own free will. And as soon as she moved, she saw the prison camp and fell back from paradise back into the prison camp. And I told Zara, this is the moment that virtual reality can provide for you. You are moving under your own free will through the spaces, and your own free will, your own movement takes you from paradise back into prison. This is something that this agency that you have as a user of virtual reality can give you an emotional shock in a way that no passive medium like film or like a painting or, sorry, even a poem can give to you. So that for me was really the driving force. And so Zara and I went through a long series. It took us 5 years to build the project. We finished it in 2000. And we went through a long series of sort of intercultural education where she told me about Iranian culture and I told her about Japanese culture. And we talked about experiences of being diaspora, Japanese diaspora Iranians, and how, you know, the real Japanese and the real Iranians think you're not real anymore. And the Americans think you're also not real anymore because otherwise, you know,
I
you
know
wouldn't
the
be.
feeling exactly. Oh, yes, that was wonderful. And I have this one last question that if you could just, given your experience with influencing the current artwork and digital mediums, what is your vision for the future regarding emerging artist roles and impact of the next generation?
Well, you know, I talked about in the Starbright world how I was interested in enabling the kids to feel like they could make their own content, even if we had to do the work of putting it into the world. And then Second Life, you know, a decade later, made that more possible. But the whole problem through these decades where people were experimenting around with virtual worlds was the problem of making 3D content. It's a lot of work, and it requires less skills now than it did then. You can, for instance, go into Tilt Brush and draw things freehand, but that still requires a fair amount of hardware. So what I see, the richness that I see of, you know, young people either of their own accord or coming out of art schools and learning all of these tools and having all of these possibilities for making things themselves so much easier than we could then in the mid 90s, is that it really becomes a democratizing influence. You know, smartphones made it possible for anyone to make photographs and videos by pulling this thing out of their pocket, you know. And there's so
Exactly.
many trips that I went on where I thought, well, shall I take my big single lens reflex camera with me? I don't know. It's a lot of weight. It's fragile. But everyone walks around with this thing in their pocket that has so much power. And you can use it to digitize things in 3D now, and you can put those in virtual worlds. So, you know, there's an explosion happening now of content made by all sorts of people, not just, so to speak, the upper, 1% who has access to, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment and the, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of training that it takes to use them. So that's the freedom that I see happening now, and the stories that are bursting out from all sorts of quote unquote underserved communities that didn't have the chance to tell their stories before. You know, for Zara and me working on Beyond Manzanar, this was a way to hold a dialogue between the experience about the experience of being scapegoated by your own country, your own government. For instance, in 1979 and 80, when during the Iranian hostage crisis, Iranians were being threatened by internment, quote unquote, just like we did to the Japanese. Mm-hmm. So for us, Beyond Manzanar was a way of telling our story, saying like, look, this has happened in the past, and guess what? It can happen in the future. And a year later, 9/11 hit, and guess what? Young Muslim men were being dragged in. Young Iranian men were being dragged in for questioning, including like Iranian Jews who are going like, wait a minute, do you know anything about anything? Why are you questioning me about an Islamic attack? So stories are coming out from all sorts of people, whether Native Americans, African Americans, whether, young women in Iran who are really tired of living under someone else's rules, telling them what they can do with their bodies. It's happening right now. Mm-hmm. All these stories are coming out, and the world is a richer place. It's a so much richer place than if you have just a tiny, tiny fraction of a percent of people who have the sole ability to tell all the stories about all the world and all the history of the world. That's the richness that we have now.
Wow. Wow. This was wonderful. Thank you so much, Tamiko. It was wonderful meeting you in person, listening to all you had to talk about and all the history and the experiences. This was really wonderful. And I'm glad that I had this opportunity to be part of this interview with you.
Well, thank you for all your questions and for this opportunity to tell the story again. Thank you.
Thank you.